Hello, friends and neighbors. This is DJ's Album Share, and I'm your host, DJ Roller. This is episode 20, and this week I'm joined by my good friend, Andrew Pauley. Andrew was my first guest on the podcast, and now he's the first repeat guest. You can follow Andrew on all social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and including YouTube. He puts out music all the time. I suggest you guys check him out. We actually discussed Drive-By Truckers Decoration Day and Cross Canadian Ragweed, Soul Gravy, the two albums we discussed this week. If you're enjoying the podcast, guys, if you're on Spotify and Apple Podcast, if you're not rating, reviewing, and following along, I don't know what you're doing. Also, go to YouTube, subscribe to the YouTube page, and also like, comment, whatever you want to do on the YouTube channel. I appreciate all you guys, and the best way to support us here is to support our sponsors. So I appreciate you guys. Enjoy this episode. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Carolina Sea Salts. Specializing in smoked sea salts, their products can be found at Etsy. Just search Carolina Sea Salts, look for the smoked sea salts, and tell them DJ sent you. Thanks, guys.
What's up, Andrew? Welcome back to the damn podcast and the new studio room.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back and to be back again and to be on video. And this place looks awesome.
Thanks, dude.
I love it.
You know,
Feel like I'm in a pumpkin.
You personally know how much I've been working on this. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah.
Dude, this is a lot of fun. It's always a lot of fun, but it's a lot of fun when I get to talk to you because we've been hanging out. We've been playing music together for a while now. We got a gig this weekend, but by the time this comes out, it ought to be gig be over. But or we talk about it. But on to the albums. The albums that you picked this week were the album that you picked this week was Decoration Day, Drive-By Truckers. I had listened to Drive-By Truckers for quite a bit. I mean, they had in the time period, this was released in the early 2000s, at the time, streaming music and everything was kind of the thing to do, and it was easy to get. And I was really into this southern rock country style genre. But it's sad to see that some of these artists didn't get as much shine as they needed to back in that era because of the whole streaming stuff. So it's pretty interesting to look back now from now's perspective and to see these guys and see what kind of following they actually have and to see the members that they started with and who joined them over time, especially with Drive-By. They I think you said before the podcast, they had the revolving door of members. So this was a really interesting band to kind of get into. So I appreciate that. But what was the thing that introduced you to Drive-By Truckers and this album in particular?
So, if I remember right, I had heard some CDs before this. But when this album came out, right, a week after it came out or so, this pool hall I used to hang out with, the Triple down on Broad Street, right? Cool bartender in there named Robert, and he always played pretty good music. And he had this on, and right as it came out, he got it that week. And I was in there, and I heard it, and I just went, aha. I was like, this is really it, because, coming out, being a huge fan of early rock and roll, blues, old school country, whatever. This is a somewhat modern American version that got it, to me anyway. And rough around the edges at times, but I absolutely love them. On this album, in particular, it was the first one with Jason Isbell, and so that's three of I think the top songwriters of my.
Especially in that genre, right? Especially in the genre of the time period you're talking about.
And the kind of alt country, Americana, alt southern rock kind of deal.
And what's crazy about music as you see it progress over time, or if you look back at it as in kind of time period pieces, right? In this era, in the early 2000s, a lot of stuff was doing a lot of these bands were doing this where it was what genre is this? You know what I mean? When you listen to it from song to song to song, you hear so many different influences and so many mashups of genres.
The ultra eclectic kind of format for a band, right?
Definitely, yeah. And also too, just the the three guys, and not saying that their songwriting is that much different, but the things that they're going through differently in their lives and the topics that they're writing about, those things was like those things were very much, the format to the album. It was a little dark, but like just hearing each songwriter's perspective on what's going on in their life at the time or whatever they're writing about at the time. It was pretty wild because you got like one guy's going through some pretty heavy shit with like I think like a divorce or whatever. Yeah. And then you got Jason Isbell talking about like drugs and shit about
family
stuff.
He has 2 songs on the record, and to me they're both like
family oriented. Like, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then I mean, so it was really interesting hearing it and hearing the 3 different guys' perspectives on what they were going through at the time. So I thought that was really interesting. I should say this is the 5th album by Drive-By Truckers, like you said, the first one with Jason Isbell. For me, I like the quote by Patterson Hood. He says, "It's a pretty dark record. Declaration Day is more or less an album about choices, good and bad, right and wrong, and the consequences of those choices." So I thought that was a pretty interesting quote. What was your first, or what was some of your more memorable moments with Drive-By Truckers as far as like inspirational for music? You say that the album you heard and it was an aha moment. Maybe there's now a couple songs of this album that jump off the page or anything?
Yeah, so, I mean, I wrote notes about every song, but I'm going to kind of pick a few. So my favorite song on the album is the 4th song. It's called "Marry Me."
Oh yeah, it sounds like the Eagles, damn near, dude.
A lot of people. It's kind of almost a running joke or a meme at this point that it sounds like "Already Gone."
Yeah.
It also kind of sounds like a song by Iggy Pop called "Pumping for Jill" and Lou Reed's song called "Romeo Had Juliet." I've heard that riff like over and over and over and over throughout the history of rock and roll, really, right?
I mean, it happens with a lot of different riffs where it kind of is ambiguous and they kind of just are.
I mean,
it's very similar,
from bluegrass music. Yeah. I mean, 1-4-5 structure for the most part, and whatever. So, but I think it's as far as modern rock and roll goes, it's like the perfect rock and roll song, and I think it has probably my favorite opening lines of a song, which is well, my daddy didn't pull out, but he never apologized.
Written down.
Rock and roll means well, but he can't help telling young boys lies. And even the second half is better. It's like a baby on the way is a good enough reason to get you out alive, get you out without having to swallow any pride. I don't know, as musicians and you get older and stuff, and it's like the choices people make,
Right.
I think that's kind of, it attacks that. A lot of that album is kind of about 6 guys, in their 20s to 30s living in a van on the road.
Right.
And kind of like you were talking about, what's going on in their lives around it. Mm-hmm.
And I think too, like I was saying, like, Drive-By Truckers and the other band, Canadian Ragweed, like that time period of music was just weird. Like you had a lot of really talented artists that were performing and out touring that people were basically listening to their music for free, so they didn't have the opportunity to monetize the way that the way that people were listening to their music. There's tons of people who know about both of these bands, but they just didn't get to monetize it the way as much, you know what I mean, because of the time period.
Yeah, well, I followed
I've always thought that was super interesting about like from 2000 to or even really like 95 to like 2010. Most of the bands that were like doing stuff that were really interesting on the indie or independent or lower level stuff, their music, although it blew up, it was mainly not paid for.
Well, yeah, and I mean a band like, I know the Truckers, their first album, self-produced and all that, and they sold some astronomical, I can't remember the number, but like for a band selling a totally indie record out of their van after shows, they did some like crazy numbers on it, right? So I think it speaks to, and I take it as an inspiration as far as like the DIY. I mean, there's a little bit of a punk rock element to it, and even hippie stuff. And that's one thing I really like about the Truckers is when you go to a Drive-By Truckers show, I mean, you might run into like punk rock kids or kind of people from the jam band scene, or maybe even like heavier rock and stuff. They kind of
they appeal to a large demographic, yeah.
Right, and but it speaks to what I still believe in, which is like the magic of live music.
Right.
because exactly what you're talking about at that time, and it's only kind of morphed and got refined in
Right.
modern times, right? As far
Right.
as the availability of music, and it's like, I mean, if you can sell yourself as a live act at any point in the past 20 years, there's something to be respected about it because people don't go to see music the way they used to.
But yeah, I mean, not in the same, not for the same reasons. You know what I mean? I don't think it's something where people go to just have a great time. I don't know. I could talk them out of my ass. I think that people go obviously for the same reasons, to have a great time, to enjoy your friends and stuff. But the appreciation of the artist isn't the same. And whereas back in the day, you looked at people looked at people on a stage, whether it be Jimi Hendrix or whatever, and it was almost an idolization of some of these people, and especially like your songwriter stuff. You got Bob Dylan, and people are just like, "Oh, he's the greatest songwriter ever." It's like, all right, yeah, sure, but some of it was the status of being where he was at, right?
Well, I think I know what you're saying, and I think there's kind of two ways you can approach it, and maybe you can split the difference, but like two ways you can approach it. Like, I'm going because I think this person is absolutely amazing at what they do, and so I want to see them live in person doing what they do.
Right.
Versus this person or this group of people creates an environment and a sonic environment that makes me so happy or
Right.
pumped up or whatever that I want to pay money to go be a part of thousands of people all doing that together. Right.
Right.
Grateful Dead or Fish or like any of these kind of classic, almost culty live bands, right? In a lot of ways, I mean, there's like worship of the guys who are the geniuses behind it.
Yeah, definitely. Like they be put on like a pedestal, and it's a lot of times difficult for them to deal with. And like with Garcia's, for example, you know, like in his life, the drugs and shit that he dealt with it, so they could just deal with it. You know what I mean? As far as that, so it's not necessarily the easiest thing to deal with either.
But I think that well, I agree with that. I think the interesting part of that though is like, as much as that music is like, you know, there's like a cult following around the musicians, like what I think draws people to it is the experience, not so much
Right.
I want to sit here in awe of Jerry Garcia or Trey Anastasio or whatever, but like I want to be part of this scene with like this music as the soundtrack.
Right.
And that's essentially what live music is, right? It's like,
I mean, that's why people fall into genres and like certain genres, and they go to listen to certain stuff. I think it's just, it's weird because there's so many different groups out nowadays, right? Where you could hear so many different styles of genres. It's almost like, it's so much out there. It's hard to kind of have just like a Grateful Dead band, or even like, even nowadays, like even a Drive-By Truckers band, because like they were pretty iconic in the time period as being like your Southern rock songwriter, country almost, but that era of country is like really weird too. You know what I mean? So like for them, it's so funny to me.
If you can find it, you must have turned over a rock or two.
For me, it's so funny that like what gets classified as country and when it's all about time periods and stuff, because like we look back at saying like, oh, the Eagles are country, but like the Eagles weren't, you know, considered to be country back in the day.
Oh no, they were a rock and roll band. But if you compared the Eagles in 1972 with the country music on the radio in 1972, I'd say the Eagles were probably overall like truer to like old school country.
Right, but they still weren't considered country.
Sure, they were rock and roll band.
Like now we can look back at this Drive-By Truckers album and hear the country influences and say whatever, but they still weren't considered like country in that. You know what I'm saying? By any means, right?
No.
So that's very interesting to me, that like what gets classified as country. When I've had moments where I was listening to classic country artists like Jerry Reed and other people, and you're like, man, is this even country? Like it's borderline. It's what's great about music is our ability to decide what genres we're going to blend together and when. So I think that these artists do a really good job of that too. It's kind of, I guess, what I want to talk about.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
For me, one of the cooler songs was "Outfit." I did like Jason Isbell's song.
Yeah,
I like that song quite a bit. Anything else that jumped off the page for this album for you, or as far as like how it influenced you? What because that is the question, right? With all the albums, like these are some of the more influential albums for us and for you personally. Like what really does it for you?
Well, I was gonna say just a couple things. There was a couple interesting facts I have.
Definitely go.
So the first song is called "The Deeper In," right?
Yeah, that's that incest song, right?
It's an incest. It's about a true story about a brother and a sister. I guess maybe they were half brother and sister, but
They
ended
got
up
jailed, I think, or
hooked
something,
up.
right?
Yeah, and it's like one of the few cases in modern history of people actually being convicted of
Incest.
committing this, right? So I thought that was pretty interesting. Also, the title of the record is Decoration Day, and that's the second Jason Isbell song on there, and it's about like a family feud. But one thing,
Kind of a Hatfield and McCoy type of feud, where it's like goes back so long you don't know how long it's been going on. You know what I mean?
He kind of references that in the lyrics, I think, in kind of an offhand way. But yeah, this kind of like it's just us versus them. But
Well, that's something that, if I'm not mistaken, that's something that Drive By does a lot of, where they reference a lot of like Southern history, folklore stuff in most of their albums, right?
big time. And that was my thing about Decoration Day is, if people don't know, it's like pretty common in the South, in small towns with small church communities and stuff. Decoration Day is like once a year where you go decorate the graves, in the graveyard. And so that's what it comes from. It's just kind of an old like Southern tradition, and so that's where the title comes from.
I think it's really cool that they understand the genre, that the music they're playing in, and how to. You're like, all right, well, let's do something a little nerdy with it, almost kind of in that realm, where you kind of have to know somebody. I mean, I knew kind of that, but I didn't exactly know.
You'd heard the term, maybe.
Yeah, I heard the term, exactly.
Yeah.
And I heard the term, and I know what people did on deck. I know people went.
Well, I think it's more important, like deeper. I mean, you're from further south than I am, and they're from way further south than either one of us.
Right, yeah.
And so I think it's probably. I mean, that's one thing I'll say, about these guys is, and I know that I've heard in interviews and stuff that maybe they balked a little bit at the term Southern rock, but they are, and so much of their identity, kind of.
The folklore behind it's like Molly Hatchet almost in that realm, right?
Lyrically and stuff, like you can't really separate the South from them, as far
right,
as,
yeah.
I mean, they're, the two main songwriters, well, and Jason Isbell too, originally from Alabama, but they kind of formed in Athens, Georgia. So we're talking about the Deep South.
Right.
And, I mean, one of the things I really like about their writing in general, getting to your question about influence and all that stuff, was, I mean, I think this is three, like I said, of the top songwriters of this era, right? And Mike Cooley is my favorite one of the three of them.
Right.
Just probably from this album and just in general, just because I kind of connect with him. He's the one who wrote "Marry Me." Sounds better in the song, which is a reference to, because he says, "Lord knows I can't change." Sounds better in the song than it does with "Hell to Pay." So it's a reference to Leonard Skinner. The record right before this they did was called Southern Rock Opera. It was a double album. It was a concept album. It's about.
And that's the one that everybody knows, right?
That's probably the big one, and then the one right after this are kind of like probably the big commercial successes.
This one and the next one are the one that Jason's on, and that's pretty much why people know of Jason Isbell doing so much with these guys.
Right, yeah, because
he's lead guitar player, right?
Well, yeah, they kind of brought him in to play lead guitar, and turns out he was
guitar player.
Yeah, he is, and he's so much of a. And I will tell you, live with them young, with him playing lead guitar, it was really pretty hot, I thought. But anyway, as far as the way these three guys write, and they all have very different voices, but they all write. About this region that they're from, and I think this record in particular has a very like small town, like kind of a southern version of a Springsteen kind of deal,
Oh, okay, yeah.
You see what I'm saying? Like
yeah,
this,
definitely.
Like,
now
slice of small town southern life and all the dark corners of it that maybe you don't typically get on your standard pop record or whatever.
For me it was just it was a lot of fucked up shit.
Yeah,
lack of a better term, man. And I was just like, damn, this is a heavy album. So I really wanted to kind of pick your brain about like what these guys and how they affected you, and especially as a songwriter, man, because like I've been influenced so much by other musicians and listen to other musicians play and trying to understand how they think, because there's only a certain amount of notes, and why do you use these couple of notes and not those, right? So I assume it's relatively the same when you're talking songwriting. I mean, just from a very, very basic perspective, where you're like, okay, you're using the English language, you have so many words or whatever, so many descriptive terms, and how do you come up with your perspective on it, and as opposed to my perspective. So I was really, really interested to pick your brain about that, man.
Thanks. Thank you.
Another thing for me, we talk. I already know the answer to this, but they don't. So, have you seen these guys live? Talk to me about some of the live stuff because I heard something. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So these guys are, I think, one of the best live bands of let's say our kind of general generation
In the era, yeah,
in
definitely.
this era. Hell of a lot of fun.
As far as like songwriting, musicianship, all the way through.
Connecting with the crowd. I mean, and I will say, I mean, I learned, you talk about things you learn from, I mean, anybody that I like, probably doubly people I don't like, but like people, I like, you take things from them that you like about their style. I mean, we were talking kind of a little bit earlier about setting up set lists and that kind of thing. And I love the way they, I mean, when you have, I mean, Jason Isbell's long gone from Drive By Truckers. I heard he went on to some other stuff. But,
Yeah. Some a few other things.
But so mainly when you go see these guys, it's Patterson Hood and Mike Cooley, and you just alternate between their songs for 2.5 hours or whatever.
Right. Which takes a lot for a songwriter to be, mainly songwriters, or solo people. To work with another songwriter too is another thing.
Yeah, well,
should be talked about.
I'll say one interesting thing about these guys, they kind of had the Leonard Skinner formula of like pretty much always having three guitarists, not lead guitarists, but three guitarists.
Right.
And it gives you some flexibility, and depending on who was in there, John Neff was a while, and he played steel guitar as well as lead, regular electric guitar, and but I think that blending of the three guitars, you can get some kind of an effect of some sort that's kind of organic that you just aren't going to get with your typical rock and roll band, I guess.
Right. And there's some mandolin on this album.
There is. Well, that was
it's electric mandolin, but I think Isabel plays it. I can't. What song is that?
Might be Patterson Hood. I know he plays one a little bit.
I think both of them play, but
They
I think Jason actually was the one.
So it's probably My Sweet Annette.
That's it.
Yeah.
I forgot. I was like trying. I didn't write it down. I remembered it, but
Yeah.
there's to me, I think there's this with these guys especially, and I love how people are always experimenting with different instruments and doing different stuff, because when you're on the forefront of kind of modern, what I'd say, like, they were modern. Again, you said they didn't really like the term, but modern Southern rock, for them to be like, all right, what can we play around with? What instruments can we mess around with? What instruments can we bring in? I love that. I love it because it doesn't accept the norm of you have to have three lead guitar players and they all play. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And you have to sound exactly like Leonard Skinner.
Right.
Because if you're gonna do that, you might as well be a cover band.
you borrow what works for you. I think that you can blend in.
Yeah.
But I mean,
I mean, totally. There's nothing wrong with what sounds good and what is good music.
Right.
But with the openness to experiment, I love.
Right.
And you find it with both of these bands. I'll move on to the next album, the Cross Canadian Ragweed.
Soul Gravy.
Yeah, Soul Gravy, dude. I ask you what your influence is, and on the album, I'll tell you about mine on this one. I actually saw, I think it was a VH1 concert or something. It was something like that, or maybe a CMT concert. I was a younger kid when I saw this, and I saw the Cross Canadian Ragweed play. And they were doing like a folk version rock and roll type of thing. And for me, playing mandolin and stuff, that's what I love to do, was like the crossover between like rock and roll and folk music and bluegrass. And so it was really like kind of spoke to me. And this album, I didn't find out about it until years later, obviously, because when I was a kid when I watched that. But the album was one of the ones just because the title that like drew me in, because at the time when I've actually found out, I think it was early 20s or mid 20s, something like that. Friggin' second studio album by Cross Canadian Ragweed. I really love how. Do you know how the name came about? So the name of the people in the band, the main four, are Cody Canada, Randy Ragsdale, and Grady Cross. That's basically a
Cro-
three. So
okay.
Cross Canadian Ragweed.
Ragweed, yeah.
And to me, like, and it's Jeremy Plato too, playing bass. They always had this really really different style of songwriting and playing, and different in that, like, you're listening to someone play again. You're talking about the early 2000s, and they were in like kind of also in the southern rock genre, but not really country, but not really rock and roll. So they appealed to a lot of different demographics. They actually worked with like some country people. I think there was some push from like Nashville they got for some songwriters and stuff for one of their songs. The
Leanne Womack is on one of the songs.
yeah,
on
Sick
this.
and Tired.
Yeah, Sick and Tired.
Sick and Tired. That's kind of like they work with some people in the industry, but still their style was so much like, you got to think about the time period. Their style was so much different than what's going on in the industry at the time.
They're probably 5 or so years ahead of.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Yeah,
and definitely since they were like just doing what they were doing, they were playing around Texas mainly.
They're from Oklahoma, I believe. So yeah.
Right, yeah, they were just mainly, from what I have read about them, they were just mainly playing around Texas and just hitting the scene out there. And Austin has been known for years as having the top tier music scene. But when you hear of all these bands that are just like content with playing around Texas, it's like, well, shit, like, what is everybody else doing wrong?
Right.
I say that facetiously, but you know what I mean. Like, it's a funny. It's funny when you hear when I do research on these bands and I'm looking up and they're like, yeah, just bumping around Texas for about 10 years. It's like, all right, well, that makes sense of why these guys were as good of musicians they were, and the songs sound as good. Like, you're putting in that work, man, putting in that time, putting in that work, putting in that effort to just go tour and play and do stuff. I really admire, and it sucks, but we at some point. We all have had to do it, but it's like you continuously. It's something that never ends. I don't think it ever ends. The grind of playing shows and playing stuff you don't necessarily. I mean, that's what, again. I think that's the goal now at this point.
I think some people do it for a season. They check out, but yeah, some people you can see where they're resigned to. That's what I want to die. Up here doing this.
We'll do this. Yeah. So, had you ever listened to this band before?
I knew the name, and I knew I'd probably heard some of these songs at some point, but it wasn't a band I ever dove into. I mean, the first thing I noticed was the bands that I thought they reminded me of that I.
Go ahead.
So, I don't know. I heard a little bit of like Georgia Satellites.
Yeah.
And
they definitely had that like 90s like almost grunge country to it too.
Well, a groove. They had they have a groove. I mean, they have a lot of soul, I think, to their sound kind of in general. I was thinking the Black Crows is another band they remind me of a little bit. And Driving and Crying. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
I'm not familiar with those guys. I'll check them out.
But a heavy dose of soul in this kind of like straightforward riff driven kind of like updated Southern rock.
Yeah. And again, in that time period, people were doing a lot of different things with genres of music. And so it's like, it was really cool for me to think about when I listen to the Drive-By Truckers album. I'm listening to it and I'm like, modern 2000 Southern rock. Who else is doing that at that time period? And really the only thing I was familiar with was this band. And so that was really, really cool with me because these guys are multi-instrumentalists. They do a lot of different shit. They are very open, like I said before, to like trying different stuff and playing around with the genre and not necessarily doing status quo stuff. So I've been a fan of these guys for years, which they stopped touring in 2015, but their music, especially, I've been listening to for years, just because, and I don't think anything ever really jumped off the page for me that was just other than especially on this album again. That was one of my favorite tracks on this album.
Yeah.
I like their hooks and stuff, but I mean, again, I listen to so much music. It just comes it comes in waves. So
Right.
I'll check into the band for about a couple of weeks and then I'm on to something else. So it's definitely been one that's been a reoccurring band throughout the years. But that was the only thing I could come up with, man, for that time period. So
yeah, well, I thought it was a nice matchup. I really did, and I thought you kind of saw like, I would say, kind of different aspects of the same, let's say, general kind of like movement that was roughly happening.
Right. Because there was this resurgence of like Southern rock in like the early 2000s of like you had I mean the reason the Allman Brothers I think really had their like second push, because like people know of I think of, or at least let me just speak back, I know of Derek Trucks from this type of movement.
Yeah.
Because what you ended up having is, you know, people who were coming of age, who were about my, or at least who were my age, who were coming of age, and my dad listened to the Allman Brothers and all this blues and shit. And so it's like, all right, what's going on in the time period? Well, the Allman Brothers are actually reformed and started touring again.
Mm-hmm.
And they had Warren Haynes playing with them, which is Government Mule playing. And then you had this young kid, Derek Trucks, playing. And then that spawns into like Derek Trucks' own like thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then these kind of bands as well were bumping around the same types of scenes. And it's just like, it's wild because the artists that I know about nowadays, I was really like trying to find in this time period. And so I guess, you know, probably why I will know of Cross Canadian Ragweed, because I don't know that they had very much commercial success. Sick and Tired, I think the one they did with that.
With Leanne Womack.
Yeah, with Leanne Womack, that they actually, you know, had someone produce and they went through the whole 9 yards with, but they actually had a little bit of success with, but they were much more about the live performance and the live show. And so that was another thing with the drive-by. I was like, man, like, who else can play a live show, or who else, not even the same, but just similarly can do a type of live show like that. And it was, you know, in the time period.
To help recreate the record?
No, for me, the band.
Just up there with them.
Yeah, up there with Drive-By Truckers live show stuff. You're good. Drive-By Truckers live show stuff is Cross Canadian, dude. Because it's like, I saw a couple of their stuff when I was a kid, and I was like, yeah, man, these guys are killer.
Yeah, so I was gonna like one of my little notes I had was that Cross Canadian Ragweed is like the better band to dance to. They have seriously, like they have like a little bit more accessible groove. Right?
Yeah.
Truckers have a little bit of punk rock to them in some parts where it's like, you know, but
that's
I think
perspective right there.
I think they're both like really riff driven.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what the one thing especially about Cross Canadian Ragweed I really noticed was that. In the mold of like the Stones or Zeppelin on a lot of whatever, that kind of like classic, like iconic riff, you know, they kind of got onto that. Like the main thing was about playing a riff, not noodling on the high stuff.
Right.
But they play some down dirty, you know.
I mean, that's all perspective at that point for me. It's like, why do you use a riff versus like whatever? You know, it's like cooking.
I kind of like the flavor of it. I mean, that was
definitely yeah. I've loved this band since I first found out about them when I was a kid.
Like Hammer Down, that was the one that that I like that riff more than I said that was my favorite riff was Hammer Down.
Nice.
But I have that just kind of in general, like, you know, I think that's like the strength of their songwriting is in this kind of like these riffs that. Have like a real seamless kind of smooth groove to them, even when they're rocking pretty hard. Like,
right.
It kind of reminded me a little bit of Lynyrd Skynyrd in a way of like Skynyrd kind of had.
I guess that was
they like slid a little bit on the back.
The common denominator between the two for me was like they both kind of have like a modern Skynyrd feel, but they went in two different directions. Like if it was a fork, you got they were, you know, Drive-By was a little more punky, and these guys were a little more like I don't know how to explain it, but almost more like folky. It was kind of a folky version of Southern rock to me, and I loved it. I kind of got in with those guys when I was younger too, just because of the music that I was playing and the instrument I was playing too.
Right.
So, man, I really appreciate you coming on again. This has been awesome. If there's anything else you'd like to say, go ahead and say it.
Well, I love the color of the room. I really want to say that. Shout out to Carolina Sea Salts, obviously our sponsor here on your show. And I tried them and it's legit. So y'all check it out too. But no, thanks for having me. I'm really excited about your new spot and excited to. I mean, I guess I'm the first one to go twice.
Twice, yeah.
So
second time on.
Honored to do this. I think it's a great idea, and I've been following it. And if y'all saw this, I hope you subscribe to it.
Woo.
Yeah, because it's cool. I love the concept. This idea of, hey, I've got an album. Okay.
Well, how many times have we done this at a bar without microphones and without a camera and without anything else? how many times we sit here and got drunk and just been like, hey man, have you listened to this album? Have you heard it because this guy's on it and he wrote this song and he put it out in this year and you know, it's the same thing we've always ever done.
Well,
and literally why we became friends, I feel like when we first
Yeah.
started hanging out together at open mics and shit, it was mainly about like, hey, let's talk about the music we like to talk about. So that's kind of where I love
It's
that
like
it
that,
keeps
that common ground. Yeah.
yeah, it keeps materializing because no matter who I have on, no matter who comes on, everybody has a different perspective on music. We all have our heroes and our influences, and it's really cool to stop for a second and go, this is who I like, because we're all wrapped up in what we're all doing.
Well, and I love it. I
Trying to
mean,
get
we
better.
talked about it on the last one, but I love it that, you know, you get the idea of the album as an art form. Like, album is kind of a canvas of sorts, right? And what
Only
I love
because
about this
I
concept,
put out music before. I feel like that's an interesting perspective because I've attempted to put music out in an album form.
So yeah,
I understand that there is a thought process to one song to the next.
some people really get it, and what I love about the idea of an album share is people are kind of digging. I mean, I would put this album, you know, up there with, like, on a good day, it may be my favorite album ever made, right? But the idea that part of what I love about that album, or why I would pick it for this thing, or why I picked the last one I picked the first time I was on, was you know, this idea of like looking at the album not as snapshots but as the whole collage. And I think that's one of the coolest things about it is you can kind of take you get a picture in your mind of a particular album.
Well, if you want to listen to singles, there's artists out there that put out singles.
Sure.
If you want to, for me, I
We take
I
their
really and
lunch
truly
money.
like if I'm working on something, if I'm cooking something, if I put on an album and I just kind of just do whatever I'm doing and I listen to it, it just takes you on. You kind of connect with that musician for a second.
Yeah.
And taking your personal criticism, whatever out of the equation, just go, I'm gonna listen to the whole thing from start to back, and then I'm gonna say something. There's actually an Eric Clapton quote where he talked about that back in the day, where he talked about like they would put on an album and their thing was not to say anything until the album was done. When you flip it over, you can talk about what just happened. But like it also gives you a moment to digest some of the thoughts and the with me with songwriting, I almost have to read the lyrics along with the songwriter to kind of grasp. Unless it's a very proficient lyric that just catches you, like the one we were talking about earlier, like that he didn't apologize or whatever, you know. It almost takes me to read it. So listening to something, you have to kind of give it a moment to kind of digest on your mind, so that you can kind of understand what the person's talking about. So I've always thought that for me, I got more enjoyment out of listening to an album from front to back. Yeah, just because you get, you definitely might have songs that you like. On there, but listening to something from front to back, you're like, all right, I can now. I have an hour. Usually an hour long. You're doing that, right? So you have an hour's worth of allowing another person to dictate how you feel, the emotions they're trying to get across, all these other things that they're trying to say. You're allowing them to say that and just kind of sitting back and listening.
Well, and I think the one thing I mainly wanted to get to before I forgot was so I think on both these albums are good examples, and particularly on the Truckers album because you're talking about three different voices like you talked about.
Right.
But a lot of the story, because the story isn't a cohesive,
it's not one person telling a story.
Chapter by chapter in sequential order, right?
Right.
But an album like that, you're kind of telling a story, but it's almost more like in a comic book form or like in a
frame by frame. I understand. Yeah,
impressionist way, right? Where there's a lot of the story is between the frames, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Okay.
On an album like that, where it's kind of sprawling and different voices and whatever. Part of what I think is interesting is the space between the songs, where you're kind of relating. This guy, and this guy just did three songs in a row, right? Let's say. And like how all those things kind of work together within this like
total picture,
right? I think is part of what makes something like that really cool.
And I really agree with you. I never thought about it from that perspective, because what I think you're saying is that you have the narrative here, you have the narrative here, and I, as the listener, get to be the one to tie it together. I think that's probably
the pictures you see that brings up.
Yeah. So for me, when I listen to a great songwriter, they're almost a little vague, because it's up to me as the listener to relate to whatever lyrics or whatever thing they're talking about, as to where it actually makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where we were talking about the first time on the first episode you were on, where I didn't, a lot of times I didn't have life experiences to understand certain things that happen, right? Sure. So I think that's part of what makes a great songwriter, is that you have a thing you're saying, but you say it in a way that everyone can relate to on a general term. Right, but it may be it may be very direct thing you're saying, but everyone kind of generally can say, okay, I felt like that before, or whatever. And so it's always been interesting to me, because I don't write that way. I write so directly. That's why I don't consider myself, because the only way I know how to describe something to say, like, if it's something that's green, I know how to say that. Like, I don't know how to go around the world to get there.
Well, the one thing I can think of is, like, you can use words or phrases. I don't know why I'm pointing up here.
Sorry.
But, like, Rorschach test.
Like,
in psychology, right? Where it's just kind of a blob, and they'll say, like, what does it make you think of, right? Uh-huh. Well, I think lyrics, like particular words or, like, phrases of words, kind of do the same thing. Or I can, like, describe something, and you use all these archetypes or whatever, right? Like a gypsy, a king, diamonds, whatever, right? Like, there's these things that are just, like, timeless as far as, like, being important and having value, right?
Okay.
So you throw that in, and with whatever's going on, and, like, you're kind of making a little Rorschach blotch, right, in that line that you're saying, and people can take all
That's
sorts
an interesting way to look at it, because we all, in theory, what you're talking about is we all interpret that Rorschach test differently, right?
You see a word or a group of words, and, like, you can get tons of different interpretations or images that people,
That was always interesting when I ever heard a songwriter write something, and then someone would be like, that song means this to me, and they're like, well, I didn't write about that, but I'm glad that you feel that way. But that was always anytime I ever saw an interview or a thing where people were like, yeah, that song means this, and they were like, well, I didn't write about that, but I'm glad you listened to it. And I that was something I caught onto at a very young age, where it was like, man, if you could figure out how to articulate something in a way that's very not necessarily, I don't like the word vague. I don't like the word vague, but it's the only way I have to describe it.
In poetry, I think what you're talking about is, like, imagery, like where, as opposed to describing, like, the facts or, like, whatever, you're describing, like, what the person should see.
Okay.
If that makes sense, what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
or even
I'm
that,
setting this scene for you, and that's gonna, like,
okay. So let's say we're looking at a sunset, and the way I would describe a sunset, it's a way that you were like, oh, well, yeah, I've seen one of them. I kind of seen something like that before.
Right.
So you're not so specific that you had to be there to see it, but you're just vague enough that where people kind of can relate to what you're saying.
Well, you can talk about a sunset, but if you just talk about a sunset, that's just boring, right? But if you talk about a sunset and, like, what the hell was going on with you at that time, and how you happened to just be there at that sunset,
right,
and it, like,
at the right moment, the right
sliced
time,
you down your middle, because it was just the natural beauty and all the bullshit that was going on with you at the time. So to me, I mean, that's the thing about. The best thing I can say is, like, sometimes I'll. People like, I don't always know what the hell you're talking about, but, like, it'll put me someplace, and I'm like, aha. Well, I
good.
Think
yeah, I did what I'm supposed to do.
I think maybe I succeeded right there, because I don't necessarily really want you to know what the hell's going on.
Right.
That's not really my goal. It's not really my goal for myself, by the way.
Interesting.
But it's more like put you somewhere.
Because you, like, listen to these. We're on a tangent. Who gives a shit?
Yeah.
You listen to songwriters. I mean, not necessarily Jason, but Jason does have a good storytelling. Songwriting style, I feel
absolutely.
But he does it in a way where you don't necessarily have had to live through the exact situation he lived through, which is for me. I'm so literal with my songwriting. I'm so to the cut the fat like
Yeah,
cut the
you
fat.
are.
I want only lean meat.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily a great songwriter
I
because
admired the hell out of it, actually.
that's the only way I know how to write, dude. I'm just like, bam, this is what's happening. You
If
know?
I'm lucky, I get that way on the choruses
God,
sometimes.
dude.
but
That's
yeah.
all I can write.
Yeah.
It's actually it makes me that's my problem with my own
Worked
songwriting.
pretty good for Smokey Robinson and the Beatles and like any number of like people who wrote. I mean, that's how you write pop music. Is you write you write stuff that is like relatable. I mean, it's what makes Hank Williams a genius to me, right?
Yeah.
Is, I mean, there's
I'm
people.
so lonesome I could cry.
There's people.
It's like,
in country
yeah,
music
everybody. I'm so lonesome I could cry. It's like everybody has probably felt that feeling. Whether the context of that feeling doesn't matter because I'm so lonesome I could cry. It doesn't matter why you're so lonesome you could cry. It matters that you're so lonesome you could cry. And so to me, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
The vagueness,
the pathos.
He says something that's an emotion that people can relate with, regardless of the context which makes them relate to it. Which is just like, God damn, I don't know how to write like that. I would be like, I'm so lonesome because I did whatever. And
right, yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4 happened. So that made my shitty day.
That made my shitty day, and that's how I write.
No, but I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit because I do think there's this balance to be had. I mean, I'm like, you know, I've been writing songs or poems like in my head anyway since I was a little kid, but it's not exactly like cool or manly, you know, when you grow up in.
It's not the preferred.
Central Appalachia, you know, as far as to be like really into poetry, man. You know what I mean? So that's kind of been.
It's not the most manly thing, but you know, at times they are changing.
But what I will say is like it's driven me as far as music because.
You know, it's funny. I'm sorry to deviate you from this really quickly.
Yeah.
But to me, Tyler Childers is like an Appalachian poet. Right, so like he does a lot of the same things you're talking about, and yeah, man, I think that going forward, I think there's going to be a lot more people who tune into that frequency that didn't before.
Well, I think both of these albums that we covered today, I hear regional influence. Mm-hmm. Like I think in Truckers, it's a little more fine tuned, whereas.
Well, Midwest
cross Canadian Ragweed, I feel like
they're Midwest. So it's a little bit different ball game, right? Like you're in just straight Texas and Oklahoma, and that's really where their career spanned.
Well, I think thematically, like how their songs are written are kind of more universal, whereas with the Truckers record, I think those. I mean, also you're talking about 3 different voices, but I think they were much more personal, right?
Right.
And I think there's there's genius in both of those. I think that's what we've been talking about. It's kind of like to write something that, I mean, I guess the perfect song would be one that absolutely touches everybody on this very common denominator, but also just happens to be like the most brilliant, like original idea of way to structure melody, lyrics, whatever, right?
Right.
That would be ideal. But you kind of fall in like those two balances or whatever. And so, I mean, I think, look, I'll put it this way. Both of those bands, I would give a limb to play on the same show with them.
Yeah, no shit.
Because they would rock it out.
I think that's the what the general public doesn't understand is that's the biggest compliment that any musician can give to another musician is like, I'd love to come play a show with you.
Share a stage with you, absolutely.
So let's end it on that, man. I appreciate you coming in. I appreciate you doing this. All the
free Ophi.
Yeah. Oh Jesus! Don't start a revolt already. All right, brother. I love
we love you. Thanks a lot, bud.